So we've created this framework of hope-centered and trauma-informed. So when we begin to ask ourselves, as we become more and more aware of trauma-informed practice, and we recognize that trauma exists in our classrooms, in our schools, in our communities, the question becomes, what do we do about that? And the answer is, hope is what you do about that. And the science is really good. So I'm going to move a little bit quicker here in just a few minutes, but I ask this question at every presentation I give. So use the chat function if you don't mind, and just think about what the answer is to what is the opposite of hope. So this is the typical answer that I get, and is despair. And while I appreciate your participation, what I'll tell you is you're absolutely wrong. It is not despair. The opposite of hope is apathy. Apathy is this idea of hopelessness. It's when we give up. It's when I look at a goal and recognize that no matter what I do, I'm gonna fail, so why try? Despair is still a part of hope because I desire the goal. It's just that my pathways are blocked. So what I want you to think about is, in this context of losing hope, is when individuals are in despair, what does desperation look like? Because despair leads to desperate action, which are oftentimes very dysfunctional pathways in order to achieve goals, right? So what we've learned is that when we start to focus on this willpower piece, is this idea that it is really based upon where we have the ability to focus our attention. And what we know is that most people are thinking about the future. At any given moment, most of us are actually imagining the future. However, we may also be reflecting on the past. Research shows, and our studies support this, is that rarely are we present. Most of the time we're either thinking about the future or reflecting on the past. Now, that can be either positive or negative, but here's what we've learned. For high trauma children, most of the time they're worrying about the future or ruminating on the past. And when you're worrying about the future or ruminating on the past, it's difficult to be hopeful, to be thinking about those pathways. And what we find is that children who spend most of their time in worry and rumination, they're suffering. They score much higher on these negative indicators. And so what we need to do is find strategies that help people think about the future and reflect upon the past in a positive way. And this is really the essence of all of the work that we do at the Hope Research Center, is looking for strategies to interrupt suffering and despair so that we can thrive. If we think about what's going on with COVID in our experience, we had these pathways, these ways of doing things that we were familiar with. And then the crisis hit, and the fear and uncertainty and the despair. And what we know is that lower hope individuals will get caught up and stay in that emotional-based coping framework of fear and despair, which leads to social isolation. However, we've been looking for how people have creatively found these alternative pathways to achieving those goals. And so we've been really focused on when we experience these crises, how that influences our capacity to hope.